why this colonialism history, British history, South Asian history, why aren't we talking about it? I discovered there were stories that are not being told. The British Empire, the British East India Company, they're all related, they're all connected to racism. And it was simply that.
Hi, welcome to Changing Suits. My name's Bal.
My name's Taj.
So you know how we've always have discussions and something pops out as I learn something. There's one subject that I've been waiting for ages to talk about, and that is colonialism. Now, I wasn't so interested before, but as we've developed the organisation and we've been having conversations with our guest speakers, this topic comes up and I've become more and more interested in how we got here, why we got here, and what impact it's had. So today we've got Shahida Rahman, who is an author of historical fiction, which we just said, I want to understand that in itself. So Shahida, could you give us a bit of an understanding as to what it means to be an author of historical fiction?
Hi, Val. It's absolutely great to be here. So when we talk about historical fiction, we're talking about history, which is fiction is based on historical facts, but fiction is a made-up story. So, for instance, you can have a setting, I'm just using an example as Victorian London. You can have a character that probably was alive at the time, but you would make up the story where it would be a fictional story, but based on real historical facts. Fiction where you can really entertain an audience through a historical lens. So I hope you can understand that, but it just gives us the opportunity to explore things further rather than give you a history lesson, which historical fiction is not a history lesson. So it's
so you're saying it's going to be exciting nonetheless.
Absolutely, yes.
Can I find out, why did you decide to become an author and write in the first place? What got you started?
Yeah, I didn't plan to become an author. When you hear that line, it just happened. I think that would be for me. I had my daughter, my youngest child, so I got 4 children. I had her in 2003, and I think a couple of years after that, my mother mentioned that we had an ancestor who worked on a steamship. And she just came out with it. We were watching something on TV. And at that moment, I thought, well, I've never heard about these men called Lascars. And I decided to do research. I just went on the internet and I thought, let me find out more about them. And at that moment, I discovered there's not a lot of information there. And I looked for history books, fiction books about these men, and I just discovered I couldn't find anything. And from that moment, I thought this would be a good way of me trying to bring out a story that I'm connected to in a fictional novel. So I think it sort of started from there, where I just wanted to get our story out as being a South Asian, because there are a lot of stories that we don't hear about. So I think that's where it started from. And I feel passionate about writing stories where I am connected with. I'm from a South Asian background, so I want to write about what I know.
I feel like we're going to go in depth. I feel like the depth is coming already. But in the fact that you tried to research your history and it wasn't there, that's a really interesting fact in itself, because it sort of shows that history has sort of been rewritten, or people and communities have vanished from history.
Or not written.
Or not written because of that, yeah.
Yes, no, I would agree with that. And I think it's how you see history based on your background. So for me, it was researching my ancestors, which I wanted to find more about. And I think when you talk about South Asians wanting to find out about their past generation, that's very hard if you haven't got written records. So for me, it started there. And I discovered there were stories that are not being told. So Asian seamen who are Lascars, and also Indian Ayahs, Indian women who were nannies at the time of British India. And I thought to myself, why aren't these stories there? Why aren't they being told? So I'm going back to 2006. This is when I first started to write about Lascars. And I thought, why are this kind of colonialism history, British history, I would say, South Asian history. Why aren't we talking about it? And I felt really disheartened, to be honest, because there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of stories out there we still are trying to discover and still need to talk about, and we're not. And what is the reason for that?
And how did you start? Because you said there's not much out there, there's not much written. So where do you start the research from? How do you
So,
start the research?
so I went into London, I went to the British Library, and I found sort of diaries based on Lascars, short articles. I looked at the old British newspapers. I went to the Museum of London. I went to Museum of Docklands. I was looking at images because there wasn't really a lot of information at the time when I was doing research to say, right, here's a textbook about Lascars. You can base a story on that. It wasn't like that at all. So I think images really helped me. I was looking at pictures, and pictures do tell you a lot without the text. So I based it on that, where we talk about East India. So where I come from, I originate from Bangladesh. I was born in Cambridge. My parents came from East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. But at the time, it was East India. And I didn't know that. I knew it was India, but not East India. So I think also speaking to other historians, which over the years I've made really good connections. We're talking about 2006 here now, fast forwarding to 2023. I've also found other family history based on someone who did travel to Ellis Island, not as a Lascar, not as someone who worked for the British East India Company. It was more of, they went from my mother's village, that this is where we discovered through ancestry.com. So the story was, we made a connection through an African American woman based in New York. And we all, my siblings we all did this test, and we found that connection. And she told us the story of her grandfather, who was from India, who had traveled on a ship to Ellis Island, and he settled in New York in the 1920s. And I thought, wow, this is impressive.
Going back to what you said, so you went to the British Library, and I will come back to what you've just said now. Is that information in the British Library? I know you've said there's articles and things, but that is, if someone did want to do this
Yes,
and look into the history, they can go to the British Library. A lot of information's there.
they can. There's so many documents, newspapers, articles. There's a whole wealth of information. I think I looked at a lot of information now is online, which is really good. And I looked at historical organizations as well to see who has what. But as I said, it's easier now than what it was when I was researching at the time.
And also, you went to an organization, ancestor.com or .co.uk,
Yes,
whatever it
yes.
is.
Yeah,
and they actually do have information, because when you have the adverts that come on TV, I always think, no, we're up there, so there's not going to be anything out there.
As well, I'm like, forget it, not even bothering. But what made you go ahead and look into it? Because automatically you'd think, no, South
yeah.
Asia.
So it was the DNA testing on 23andMe, which is connected to ancestry.com. So my brother decided, let's do this. This will be interesting. And thinking, no, we're not going to find anything.
I'm going to try this.
And we did, and we made that connection. So you put it goes on a database that they sort of make that connection with someone who may have been related to you. I to be honest, it's still a mystery to me to see, are we really sort of connected to these people?
Yeah.
But to find that connection from my mother's village, she doesn't have any of it. She doesn't believe it. She said, no, you can't go back that far. She's in her 80s. And I think a South Asian woman of that age is really hard to explain something like that to them. And I was saying to my mother, it could have been.
We weren't convinced for a second till you said it. So fair enough to her.
Yes. So, but it was so fascinating. So we got this grainy image of him, and we got his name, we got the shipping records, which ship he travelled on, his age, a group of other men who were with him at the time. So we were given that by the connection we had from that lady in America. So she is trying to find out where her grandfather is buried, because he married an African American woman in the 1920s. He had 2 daughters. So one of the daughters was her mother. His wife died. He lost custody of his 2 daughters because he was classed as an illegal immigrant. The word would be alien, in those days. So they think he went on to marry another woman, but he lost connection with the 2 daughters. So I think for her, it's more like trying to find that closure. Where is he buried? What happened to him? We're talking about 1940s now. What kind of life did he have? Where is the son, the so-called son he had, who was called George? So it was interesting to see. There were men out there who, they went to America, they married African American, and if you think about 1920s America, rife with racism, particularly with the black community, the African American community, and for an Asian to go into that community, into that society, what they could have gone through.
But the fact we always pride ourselves on this organisation trying to break through cultural barriers. If that's not breaking through cultural barriers, then I don't know what is, I guess, is it?
Yes.
But I was going to say, like, back in our parents' times or whatever, nothing was really documented that much, even in our grandparents' times, should I say. Even registering their birth was a big deal in itself.
I mean, they don't even know birthdays now in India, a lot of people, because they don't register it. So
true. I mean, it would be my mother who she doesn't know her exact birthday, but
it's usually the 1st of January, isn't it?
It is. Always.
For listeners that don't know why we don't always know the real dates of birth, why don't we know the real dates of birth?
Well, they simply weren't recorded at the time. But I think when my mother did travel to Cambridge, she came here in 1964. So I think people have an idea of how old they would have been at that time. That's what it was. And then pick a birthday, I think. I mean, for her, I think by having eye tests, it can determine your proper age. And that's what happened to her, at the time where she did have those eye tests and they sort of worked out, okay, she's probably that age. But I think based on her passport date, she would say she's probably about a couple of years out.
I was going to say she's still 20 years old.
Yes, yes,
all of our
yes.
parents are like that, aren't they?
Okay, so I mean, as you can tell, I think we're going to go away and do the search. It's amazing. I've never thought about it. But let's talk about British colonialism. What have you learned on your journey of the past?
I've learned a lot. And I've learned a lot of shocking information. I think shocking in a sense where, okay, we still talk about racism to this day. And racism was rife in the times where I was doing my research. So I did research in the Victorian era, where South Asians arrived. So many of them that ended up becoming doctors, and they were medical students. They came to top universities. But there were many who worked on British steamships to ferry back cargo from other countries, such as tea, coffee, sugar, porcelain. So these men stoked the engines. So they were employed, in thousands. But when we say employed, so they weren't slaves of the empire. They were hired. They were taken on to do these jobs, but they were underpaid. So some of the stories that I read, there was, as I said, a lot of racism, cultural misunderstanding of faith. There were communities who sort of came together from South Asia.
Obviously, when the British did go over, they did learn a lot about the culture. They knew a lot. So it's not out of ignorance that they may have not understood it. Do you think there was something more sinister? I've just answered the question there because they did know. They know a lot more than we do.
Yes, they did. They went out there. They lived in it was British India at the time. That they took on people to work as servants, and I have to say, not everyone was treated badly. I can't paint that picture as saying that the British treated South Asians in that way. No, some people were honoured to work for the British as servants. So we had Indian women, we had Asian men. You can see pictures to this day where you will see the British in British India, and they loved living in that country. They learned so much, and then the British ended up having to leave India, and that's where it really hit home, where they loved that culture, that atmosphere, the weather, having a servant to serve the families, which they got used to.
But why would you like to be a servant for the British? What would be, because you said some people did enjoy doing it. Why would you enjoy doing it?
I think for a better life, because at that time, India was going through famine. There were lots of issues, within society. People were looking, in a sense, for a better life.
I saw this clip, it was quite a while ago, and it was an academic saying, well, the GDP, the economy was thriving before the British got there. Now, I'm not here to obviously have a go at the British, because to be fair, throughout our lives, we've not been told as to what British colonialism actually meant. We've always seen a positive side of, the pomp and whatever we see on the TV now, to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to the British being there, the economy was thriving, wasn't it, Shahida?
It was indeed. So that was a magnet of taking advantage of that. I would say that's exactly what the British did. I know it can be a subject where there's a lot of debate around that. But yes, India was doing really well. The British moved there to, the shipping trade expanded to all corners of the world. But I think with India, it is sad to see, this is what happened in India and what it resorted to, where people became poor, they suffered from famine. Is that what should have happened in those days? So I think when we sort of talk about South Asian history, there's a lot of people who don't want to talk about the negative aspects of it. But we do need to talk about this because we need to educate people and get them to understand what happened.
But then going back to what Taj said, why would people want to be servants to the British? They were living in famine, but let's not close our eyes to the fact that that famine was caused because the British had got there, and that's why they were in that situation. So that
Yes.
proudness of being a servant at that time, I mean, now looking at it with the things that are going on around us and trying to understand what's going on with EDI, racism, so on and so forth, is very much caused by the British. But
Yes.
then they were
Yes.
then the saviours because they were the ones that saved those people from the famine.
Yes. I think, if you talk about racism, what has changed since then? We're talking about people who had a different culture, different understanding, different type of living, different food, different dress. It all sort of came together. But yes, it was more of, if you're white skinned, you've got more authority than those who have dark skin, and you still see that today. Which is sad. And is that going to change anytime soon? No, I don't think it will, because we are still seeing that same kind of racism. And we talk about British colonialism, it seems like a dirty word for a lot of people. People don't want to talk about that. And the British Empire, the British East India Company, they're all related, they're all connected to racism. And it was simply that. So I think, there were people who didn't have a choice. They were taken on to do these jobs. But those who were Asian seamen who worked on steamships, they wanted a better life. And they thought, wow, we can travel, we can go to different parts of the world, we can see exotic countries. So they were curious. It was a chance for them to leave their homes and explore. But they didn't know what they were getting themselves into
So,
at that time.
do you think because even in the South Asian community, lighter skinned people are seen to be, they're prettier and stuff like that? Do you think that stems from colonialism? Basically, the white skin was seen more superior. Is
Yes,
that connected?
yes. Yeah, I would think so, because even to this day, being fair is being pretty. And there are women and young girls out there who are always cautious about how they look.
Yeah,
You have these creams and soaps out there in South
bleachers.
Asia,
Yeah,
to give you that fair color skin. Even on women who are getting married on their wedding day, they are literally caked with makeup to look fairer. But it's really sad, because it's taking so much work and effort to make young girls to be comfortable in their own skin. But how can you be when you see these adverts and posters and showing that being white and fair is beautiful, and that's something that we experienced when we were young. We always thought, well, if you're fair, you're beautiful. And that was it. It's how you looked on the outside.
So Shahida,
Mm.
let's talk about the research that you've done in regards to the seamen, because obviously they've been lost from history, unfortunately. What did you discover that shocked you?
I think what shocked me was the racism. The appalling treatment. I can give you examples where some seamen, they were flogged, they were beaten, they were fed rotten food. So you can imagine the food that was taken on these ships used to take 3 to 4 months to travel from India to England, and they were simply fed with rotten food. Many of them were malnourished. It was more of, dried meat. It was rice and lentils. They needed to eat. They simply had to have this kind of food. But also, where the captain of the ship, they couldn't speak their language. These group of men, they sort of stuck together. They were, when they were employed at the time, they were employed in groups from particular villages. So it wasn't one person from here and one person was there. They all came collectively to be employed, and some were flogged, hung upside down. Some Muslim sailors were even fed pork by no fault of their own. So you can imagine the despair that these men went to, and there were stories of men jumping off ship.
If you look at Black history, we're
Yes.
starting to learn quite a lot within schools about Black history. And what you're saying there in regards to slavery and how they were treated, I didn't know that it was the same for the South Asian community as it was with the Black community.
Yes, and I didn't know either, because it's only what we get told through history books and what we learn at school. We're still not learning through schools about South Asian history. We have South Asian Heritage Month now that is a raising awareness of history, heritage and culture. But there are really, interesting stories, really shocking stories that we still need to discover and talk about. So yes, I would say they were treated as slaves, even though they were taken on. This is the debate around this: is they weren't forcibly taken on to work, they chose to work, but the way that they were treated. So I would say that is slavery. It's, people didn't have a choice. They had to work in under those conditions. And when they did arrive in docks in the UK, in England, many jumped ship and they never wanted to travel back to India because they didn't want to go back on those ships being treated like that again. So they decided to have a new life in England. So many of them didn't travel to England to stay here. They wanted to go back. It was a chance for them to make money, take that money home. But because, can you imagine 3 or 4 months being treated in this way? I'm never going to go back on these ships again. And this is where their lives started in England. But again, it was another story of being destitute, going through racism again. It was just so much for them to endure at that time.
What kind of racism did they go through when they did basically land in the UK? And
So I think with most of them being dark skin, some of them were called darkies. This was a common term in Victorian England. So anyone that looked different, obviously, they were classed as second-class citizens. So you can imagine these men being destitute. Some of them resorted to begging. They did odd jobs such as street sweeping. They used to sing, play on the tom-tom, dance in their own languages just to make a little bit of money. Many of them ended up in workhouses because they needed somewhere to stay and also just work for, just to buy bread at the end of the day. But there was a community who lived on ports together, but they simply didn't have a place to go. And then gradually, Christian missionaries, they saw what these men were going through and they set up homes for them. So it was the Strangers' Home that was set up in East London, and it was set up by a Christian missionary because he simply felt, he had sympathy for these men, that they shouldn't be treated in this way. They need a place to stay. They need something to eat. Even with the clothing, they came in these pajama-like outfits. They weren't prepared for the cold weather. Many of them died on the streets because they simply couldn't, there wasn't a place for them to stay. So I think that was quite shocking, where you would see, I'm sure hundreds of people would see them on these streets of London. But did anyone actually say, let me help that person or let me take them in?
but if they're seen as aliens, why would you help someone that is so different to you, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
exactly. And they didn't understand who these men were. And I think there was a lot of resentment as well at that time because these men took these jobs from the British, with white sailors, and there was resentment saying, well, we can't get jobs because of these men. And it is that kind of term you will still hear today.
They come here, take our job. Oh my God.
Yes, which they did, but they were underpaid. They weren't even paid half of what the white workers were, white sailors. So again, that just over 100 years ago, we're still seeing those kind of terms today. So you think, what's changed when it comes to racism? What has changed? Nothing has changed. We're still talking about the same issues we may have talked about over 100 years ago.
And the fact that we're still using those lines, they come here, take our job.
Yes,
And it hasn't
yeah,
moved on. That's crazy.
yeah,
Now,
yeah.
Shahida, so the time that you're talking about is obviously pre-partition, isn't it?
Yes,
So what
absolutely.
years would we be looking at where we would have South Asian people coming over as seamen? What time period are we looking at? Because obviously the British were there for hundreds of years, weren't they?
Yes. So South Asian men, they started to come over here over 350 years ago. This is where it started. But I think the majority of Lascars, they came, I would say, early Victorian, Victorian times. So it would be around about 1850s onwards. And then the number of men taken on to be employed on these ships increased every year. So, with my research, I particularly looked at, Victorian history with South Asian history. But when we talk about racism, you have to remember that Queen Victoria had a servant who was from India, Abdul Karim. He was from India, and to have someone so close to the royal family in that way, where Abdul Karim, he also suffered from racism because of the white elite, the people around him, and that is a good example of seeing someone in that family to actually experience those kind of racism. And I think with the film, Victoria and Abdul, that is, such a wonderful film to see. But I think the thing that shocks me in the end is what happened to him after the Queen died. And I thought,
It's back to the
wow,
racism, wasn't it? I saw
yes,
that. Yeah.
exactly, yes, and
Excellent
you
film.
don't hear about that. No one talks about what he actually went through. So yes, but this is more of, okay, it's in a film, but I would love to one day see a film about Lascars and what they actually went through, and we're still yet
I've
to
heard the
see that.
term Lascars, to be honest, which is shocking that
Yeah,
you know.
it's more of a Middle Eastern word, I would say.
Yeah,
It's a soldier, sailor, and they were from the Middle East, China, but later they came from India.
Something that's come up in my mind as you're talking. Now, we tend on this podcast, and I'm going to be really open, we tend to stay away from faith because obviously it can be very divisive.
Hmm.
Now, from what I've heard prior to the British coming in, all faiths within India lived side by side.
They did.
And, unfortunately, we are in the South Asian community where faith is divisive. But where did that division come from then? Was this a sort of strategy of divide and rule, as it were, within India? And that's, I wasn't planning to, but as you were talking, I think this is a really important point. For me, I think it's
Yeah.
a really important point because India has so many religions.
Exactly, and people used to live together in harmony side by side. And I think the partition did it. We talk about the partition all the time. We've got the anniversary coming up in August, where the British decided who should live where. And to this day, it is sad that we are seeing so many South Asian communities being divided in that way. But when I talk about South Asian seamen, yes, there were Hindu seamen, there were Muslim seamen, Christians as well. They all worked together because they saw themselves as one. No one really looked at their faith. They were from the same culture, the same background. So I would say, yes, the partition was an instigator, and people still talk about the partition. Why did it happen? Why did it happen in this way? Why did the British do that? So there's still a lot of questions that we are asking, and we still need to find the answers of why. It is heartbreaking to see how India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, how they have progress, but to this day, with racism in different forms, how it's evolved, but it's still the same. You can describe racism in different ways, but it's still the same as it was 100 years ago.
What other occupations were there? So we've spoken about seamen. What other things
Oh,
did
let's talk about
sort
Ayahs,
of...
actually. So
Yeah, yeah.
what was
So yes, so that's another example of they were the first South Asian women to come from India to work. They worked in British families, taking care of English children. The British were in India at the time, and they were almost like mothers to young children. They were a substitute, basically. They used to do everything for that child. So they also came at the time where Lascars had come. And again, it was a story of some of them were abandoned, they were dismissed, they had to find ways of fending for themselves. And this is where the Ayahs home was set up so it's similar to what Lascars had, the strangers home they had, but Ayahs, they had an Ayahs home because they needed a place to stay. They were destitute. So with these women, yes, I would say they were the first Indian women to live in England. But again, they didn't plan to settle here. They wanted to go back, and there were stories of Ayahs who travelled dozens of times back and forth with families from England to India and so forth. But if if you could imagine, they left families behind, but they were also made outcasts because they crossed the river, they crossed the Kalapani, where it was called the Black Water, and it was regarded as a taboo where they made that crossing and they shouldn't have done. So some of them decided they didn't want to go back home.
Could you explain that a bit more? When those ladies decided to go to England, would their families not have backed them up and said, no, that's fine, you're making a wage? Or how would that have worked?
Yes, some did. Obviously they were looking for a better life. So, for someone to make that decision to leave their family, to leave their homes, to leave their countries for a better life. And this is exactly what these women wanted to do. They were paid. It was a job for them to do. It was more of a business trip, to travel on these ships. So yes, but I would say most of them were widows. They were a lot older. And my second book is about an Indian ayah. It's called An Ayah's Choice. But I made my character into she was a young woman, aged around about 19. And then she has a relationship with her employer. And the reason why I did that, so I had some people saying to me, "Oh, do you want to even go through those depths of an Indian woman having a relationship with her master?" But it happened. But we don't hear a lot of these stories. We hear ayahs traveling back and forth to India, working with English families, but we don't hear about the relationships, the affairs, even the sexual assaults that some women experienced on ships by even Lascars, because they travel together. But there's very little evidence of these kind of stories because women were simply afraid to speak out. They didn't want to, it was a taboo subject. You wouldn't speak about that kind of thing
So why would
at
they
that
bring the
time.
Ayahs over? Just because they were cheaper labour?
Yes, cheap labour. Yes, indeed. So you can imagine with some of the English women who took on these ayahs. So the ayahs, they cooked for the children, they cleaned, they did literally what a mother should do. So they were a substitute mother. So many of the children, they were very close to these ayahs, and these women used to sing songs in their own native language, and but then when the children grew up a little bit, they were sent off to boarding school. So they never saw these ayahs again, or ayahs were dismissed. And I still hear stories to this day where I've spoken to people where they were taken care of ayahs, and they always wondered, well, what happened to them? Because they suddenly left our lives. That was it. We were so close to them, but then they just disappeared. So I've had conversations where, they just wanted to know what happened to them.
In regards to the Lascars, it's quite clear they got onto the ships and they were treated badly.
Mm.
But was that the case in this scenario for the women? Because it sounds like there was respect for them. They were the second mother, essentially.
It's interesting you say that. I think with ayahs who travelled on ships, they still had to sleep on the floor in a different quarters, not with a family. Some were even sleeping outside the family's rooms on the ship. So, they were also mistreated, but it was normal for them, because they were classed as being second class citizens, because they were Asian, dark color skin. So there was an element of racism there, even though that they were employed and they were taken on by families to look after children. But having said that, some of them were treated very, very well. Some of the Ayahs had really wonderful stories to tell, and they were very fond of these children. But again, they were mistreated. So, with both genders, there was a lot of, again, racism, a lot of mistreatment, and it was these stories people don't want to talk about. So at the time when I was doing research, you know, I had people say to me, why do you want to talk about our slavery past? It's something that we don't want to talk about. We don't want to even acknowledge. So for me, I think it was important to bring out that history to educate people.
Why do you think it is important for us to look back in the past and,
I think it's understanding history better, what our ancestors went through. We're all South Asian here today, so we've all got different backgrounds, but our cultures would be similar. Our languages are literally, there's not much difference in it, but from where we come from, with the food, with the dress, with the culture, there's a lot of similarities. Putting faith aside, we still have a lot of similarities. But I think it's important for us to understand the history, because we need to understand what they went through. It's honoring their memory. For me, that's how it feels like, because we shouldn't forget what they went through. The sacrifices they made, the treatment that they endured. Why should we forget that? We should educate the British people from all over the world to understand, okay, this is South Asian history and this is what happened. Again, as I said earlier, people don't want to talk about it. They simply don't. They like to talk about the positive things. And I think, as with any history, we all like to talk about the positive things. No one wants to talk about the negatives. But for us to understand what happened in India, which led to the partition, and what we're still experiencing today with racism, they're all connected together.
I think what's come about in this episode is the fact that what happened hundreds of years ago is very much happening now. Now we can try and, rewrite history as the history books have very much done. But if we don't bring up what happened in our history, we're not learning from it. And that very much is where we are now. We haven't learned from it because we are still. The sad thing is, we talk about taboo topics on this podcast, but those are the same taboo topics that have stemmed from something.
Yes.
Where did they start from? Because we can all say, yes, we agree with, equality. But the fact is, we are still in a culture, and that's not South Asian culture alone. We are in a society where certain cultures, genders, whatever, are put down, and that is coming from something. So I think you've made such a good point. We need to understand what actually happened. What is the truth behind all of this?
Yes, I think it's educating our own communities more than anything for me.
Yeah.
Through my stories, I always found that, okay, people of non-South Asian background, they are curious, they want to also understand the British history. But for me, it's educating our South Asians, because for future generations to come, through my books and my stories, I wanted to help people understand that. We can write history books. Okay, people aren't going to pick up history books just to read them. It's only if they need to use it as a reference or some research. But this is the reason why I wrote a historical fiction, because I wanted to. I think the first thing is to entertain people. That is the most important thing. As an author, you want people to be interested and entertained by your story, but also, I would say, a lesson and educating people at the same time. So it's a combination of all that. And thankfully, I've managed to do that through my stories, because people have said to me, "Well, I didn't know this happened," or is this based on a true story? But no, they're not. They are based on a true story, but these characters could have been, and would have been at that time. So for me, being from a South Asian background, I feel very passionate telling these invisible history. That's what I used to say many years ago. I've been writing for a few years now, but when I first started out, it's talking about these invisible communities. And now we're seeing a lot more research, a lot more content out there, articles, books, to tell these South Asian stories. But we simply need more.
So in schools, they are teaching about Black history, but why aren't we still learning about South Asian history? Why are we still not?
Yes, that's something I've sort of looked at over the years. It's slowly starting to come into the curriculum. There are certain schools who are looking at the British Empire, who are looking at, they're looking at South Asian Heritage Month, which is, a great time of the year to sort of really educate people. But I think it comes to, how much British history do we want to teach our children? When we talk about South Asian history, we have to talk about British India. We have to talk about the British Empire. That you would be educating children about that first, and then you bring in South Asian history. So they're still lacking. It really is. We do talk about Black History Month, but there still needs to be more work going into schools to educate children.
But where you've said we have to teach them about British India first, I don't agree with that. I really think we
Mm.
need to talk about pre British India, because this hierarchy, which is very much in 2023, it stems from the sounds of it, and I could be completely wrong, from that British India perspective. However, there was a life prior to that, and it
Mhm.
and it the cultures, the unity. There's obviously stories behind that as well, which we will explore in the future. But I think we need to understand that first before we then dive into the British India. And the other thing to say is we are British people. In this country, we are British, and that's something we need to take on as well, because it's not a them and an us, it's a we as a society, I would have thought.
Yes, I think when I say we start off with British India, I've never really gone back before, the British time, British East India Company time, what India was at the time. But I think it's just looking at when we say teaching British Empire history is what they did. That this is what I've got in my mind is what they did at the time, how they conquered the world, literally, and it was to do with theft as well, racism, where people's lands were taken away from them. It's all these kind of history, but where did that stem from? That stemmed from the British, didn't it? So you need to start somewhere. Yes, you can educate people what happened before that, but is it something that people would be interested in, especially young children? When we talk about the British, especially when we talk about the British Empire, and then we're talking about the King's Honours and the Queen's Honours, and it's the British Empire Medal. You get that kind of debate as well. That people find that term very offensive. We're still talking about the British Empire to this day, but there's still a lot of work to do with children, because I think it will help them understand. If you want to combat racism, you teach them about the past. How else are you supposed to do that? I mean, when I was younger, I did receive racist comments at school, and there was this time when I said, I was thrown the p word, which is sad, because I think in the 60s and the 70s, I grew up in the 70s, and I remember saying to one young lad when he said that to me, and I said, I don't come from Pakistan, and he literally fell silent. He was shocked because I
Because you
actually
didn't know what
said
you were talking about.
that. And that still sticks in my mind. I think I just felt I had to say something, but you always felt as if that it was a dirty word in those days. And, I experienced that. And it was only later on where you had children being very curious about your culture and your background, and the clothing and the food, and that kind of thing. But, to this day, we are still seeing that same kind of racism. So what's changed over the years? So we have to educate children based on our history for them to understand that this is what they went through, this is what it was all about, this is what history is, for them to understand.
Do you think things are changing? Do you think the younger generation are questioning things more? Because when the king's
Yes.
coronation happened, it was a case of there was quite a lot of people our age and younger that were like, nope, I don't believe in, I don't want to see it, I don't want to watch it, I don't want to know anything about it because of the history. Whereas before with the Queen, it was a case of, no, let's watch her on TV. To be honest, I've watched
Mm.
everything royal apart from the coronation. What do you think there is a change happening that we're questioning how our past was, and that's why we don't want to support the royals anymore?
Yes, because of the British Empire, and we talk about the Kohinoor diamond, and that was a huge issue at the time of the
Yeah.
coronation, which is when we talk about the story of the Maharaja Duleep Singh, who his daughter was Sophia Duleep Singh. She was involved in the suffragette movement at the time. She was a prominent Indian woman. She was a goddaughter to Queen Victoria, and her father literally had everything taken away from him from the British. He was left destitute right at the end, but his background, he was a rich man. He owned so much land. It was one of his diamonds. It was taken from the British. So when we talk about British Empire, we always talk about people stealing, and then the royal family sort of stemmed from that, and they continued to generation after generation with those diamonds.
This is going to be a bit controversial.
Yeah.
And I really shouldn't, because we usually finish off by here, but I need to throw it in and see what you think. We're saying that the British went to, it wasn't only India, it was very much other countries as well. But can you compliment the British because it was a fantastic strategy? What do you think, Shahida?
No, not with a strategy of mistreating people and racism. No, you can't call that fantastic because of the suffering. People were killed, defending their homes, and there was famine, and people were left starving. No, that isn't a fantastic strategy to treat people in that way. And it still hurts to even think about it today.
But then if we look at any war, there will be casualties. I mean, we look at the war now in Russia and Ukraine, there are casualties. And it is the common man that will be those massive casualties. The British, though, did go over and rule over a lot of the globe. So from their perspective, it very much was a success, wasn't it?
From their perspective, but not from the South Asian perspective. And that's why when we talk about colonialism, it's a dirty word. It's seen as a dirty word, and people don't want to speak about that. So there's sort of two sides of the argument here. So if you support the British, you think that the British did a fantastic job. Well, yes, but for us, it was no. That what these people actually went through. People were left to starve. They had so much in India, and I can't say it was a success. And we're still seeing that we can never shake off that history. Even to this day, when we look around us, there's still remnants of the British Empire. We're still connected with something that's connected to the British Empire, and I think it's still sad that we are still talking about that today.
Do you think we would have been, if all the colonialism didn't happen, do you think we would have been still back at home in India? Or for us, it's not home, we're British, but richer, happier? What do you think the situation would have been?
It's a very good question.
Shoulda, woulda, coulda.
Yeah.
Yes, you just simply don't know. We're only looking at what happened. But yes, I mean, the way that India was. And when we talk about the partition, would I have originated from Bangladesh? It all sort of, I could have been from India. We have apparently Mongolian ancestry. We sort of identify that. So it's when the Indians, they moved further into East India. But yes, that's a question I've never really thought of that in that way. But yes,
There's your next book,
could
then,
have been.
Shahida.
Yes, absolutely. We just simply don't know. We don't know.
Shahida, could you give us the titles of your books?
So my first book is called Lascar, and my second book is An Ayah's Choice. So they're both South Asian historical fiction, and it would be great if you could read and see what you think yourself. It will give you an insight of the British Empire and also South Asian history at the same time.
I just want to say you've been so inspiring. So thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for your time.
Yeah, I could have done this for another 3 hours, to tell you the truth. I mean, Taj doesn't ask this many questions. Usually we're done by the end, but I think we've still got hundreds of questions afterwards. But thank you so much. Like I said, we've learned, firstly, what historical fiction is. And it is so important that we do support Shahida and other people that are researching the past, whether it's history books. And like you said, Shahida, we aren't the biggest fans of history books, unfortunately, but historical fiction definitely sounds like something that we could take to. Thank you so much. We've learned so much about our history.
You're welcome.
Just to finish up, what would you advise for someone that is interested in finding out about what happened in their ancestry past? What could you advise them to do?
I would suggest to find out as much as you can. So go through those DNA testings, you just don't know what the connection is. And for us, when we made that connection, we never imagined that we would even find anything beyond 1930s even. But it's just amazing because there's so much for us to learn about. But no one's going to do it for us. We need to do it for ourselves. So just go out there, find your history, and who knows, there may be something hidden in the closet somewhere. It will be great to tell those stories.
I can see Taj is going to be Googling straight after this, which is fab. We're sisters, so I don't even need to spend whatever you need to spend. So there we are. That's me doing that. Thank you so much for your time today, Shahida.
Thank you. And thank you for your time. And I hope that was educational and informative at the same time. So,
it really was.
Great. Thank you. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
That's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.